The night my father pointed his finger at my face and told me to shut down my company or get out of his house, I finally understood something I should have seen years ago. They didn't want me to succeed. They never had. And what waited for me in bankruptcy court the next morning wasn't an intervention. It was an ambush they had planned long before I walked through that door. I had driven 3 hours from Phoenix to Scottsdale that evening because my father sent me a text message that simply read, "Family emergency, please come home." Those 4 words made my stomach drop. I imagined hospital rooms and grave diagnoses. I imagined my mother crying in a waiting room while doctors delivered terrible news. What I did not imagine was walking into a trap that had been set months in advance. The house looked the same as it always had. A sprawling ranch-style home with terracotta tiles and a circular driveway that always made visitors feel small. My father built this house when I was 12 years old, right after his real estate company closed its first major commercial deal. He never let any of us forget that. The house was a monument to his success, and everyone who lived inside it was expected to worship at its altar. When I walked through the front door, I found them waiting in the formal dining room. Not the kitchen where we ate most meals growing up, but the formal dining room with the crystal chandelier and the mahogany table that seated 14. My father sat at the head. My mother Linda sat to his right, her eyes fixed on her untouched salad, and my brother Caleb sat across from her, his arms crossed, radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who had already won a game I did not know we were playing. There was no medical emergency. There was no crisis requiring my presence. There were 3 place settings, 3 glasses of wine, and 1 empty chair clearly designated for me. My father did not stand when I entered. He did not ask about my drive or offer me something to drink. He simply gestured toward the empty seat and said, "Sit down, Harper. We need to discuss your future." I should have turned around and left right then. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. But I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, trying to prove that I was worthy of being a Whitlock despite choosing a different path than the one they had mapped out for me. So I sat down. My mother still would not look at me. She pushed a piece of lettuce around her plate like a child avoiding vegetables. Caleb leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who had already won a game I did not know we were playing. My father set down his fork and knife with deliberate precision. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me the way he looked at contractors who had disappointed him. "That cybersecurity company of yours," he said, "CentraShield or whatever you call it, you need to shut it down." I felt the words land like physical blows, but I kept my face neutral. I had learned long ago that showing emotion in this house was considered weakness, and weakness was never tolerated. I asked him why. My mother finally spoke, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound concerned, but was actually delivering criticism. "We are worried about you, sweetheart. You have become obsessed with this startup. It is not healthy. You are 32 years old, and you should be thinking about settling down, not chasing some fantasy about computers." Caleb could not resist adding his perspective. "The company has no real valuation," he said. "No serious investors, no future. You are embarrassing the family by pretending to be some kind of tech entrepreneur when everyone knows you are just burning through money on a hobby." I looked at my brother and remembered all the times he had mocked my interest in technology. When I started CentraShield 8 years ago, he laughed and gave me 6 months before I came crawling back to work for the family business. I asked them what exactly they expected me to do. My father leaned forward and I saw something in his eyes that had never been directed at me before. It was not disappointment or frustration. It was cold, calculated intent. "I have prepared legal filings," he said. "We are taking you to bankruptcy court tomorrow morning. You owe this family $3 million in investment capital, and we intend to recover it." The words did not make sense at first. I had never borrowed $3 million from anyone. My family had never given me a single dollar for the company. In fact, they had refused when I asked for a small loan during my first year of operations. I asked my father when exactly I had borrowed this money. My mother looked away. Caleb's smile widened, and my father slid a manila envelope across the table toward me. "The paperwork is all in order," he said. "Your signature is on the loan agreement. The terms are clear. You have failed to make any payments, and we have no choice but to pursue legal remedies." I opened the envelope with hands that remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Inside, I found a loan agreement dated 8 years ago, financial statements that claimed CentraShield was insolvent, and a promissory note bearing a signature that was supposed to be mine, but it was not my signature. The handwriting was close, but the loops were wrong, the pressure was inconsistent, and anyone who had ever seen me sign a document would know immediately that this was a forgery. I looked at the metadata information on the financial statements. The file had been created 5 days ago. The fonts did not match what would have been standard 8 years prior. The entire package was a fabrication assembled recently by people who clearly did not understand that digital forensics could expose their fraud in minutes. I asked them if they truly believed this would work. Caleb stood up from the table, his voice rising with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. Tomorrow morning you will stand before Judge Eleanor Marsh. If you do not cooperate, we will report you to the IRS and the Department of Defense. We know you have been hiding debts and misrepresenting your financial situation. This ends now. The Department of Defense. Those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how much they did not understand. They had somehow discovered that my company had government connections, but they had no idea what those connections actually meant. I stood up from the table and looked at all 3 of them. My father with his cold eyes and his manufactured evidence. My mother with her complicit silence and her averted gaze. My brother with his jealousy disguised as concern and his desperation to remain the golden child. You really think CentraShield is just some worthless startup, I said. My father waved his hand dismissively. We know exactly what it is, a money pit that has consumed 8 years of your life and produced nothing of value. I walked toward the door without responding. There was nothing left to say in that house. Tomorrow they would learn the truth. Tomorrow they would discover that the company they dismissed as worthless had just been awarded an $89 million contract with the Department of Defense. Tomorrow they would realize that the forged documents they planned to present in court would trigger a federal investigation that would consume their lives. But they did not know any of that yet. They thought they were destroying me. They did not understand that they had just handed me the weapon I needed to finally be free. As I drove away from that house for what I suspected would be the last time, I thought about the security cameras I had noticed in the dining room, the ones my father installed after a break-in scare 3 years ago, the ones that had recorded every word of our conversation, including his admission that he had prepared legal filings and his threat to report me to federal agencies using fabricated evidence. They thought they were taking me to court to end my career. They had no idea they were walking into a federal investigation of their own making. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive away. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the shock of finally seeing them clearly. How could people who claimed to love me conspire to destroy everything I had worked for? How could my own mother sit silently while my father threatened to ruin my life with forged documents? This was not the first betrayal, but it was the first time they had made their contempt so explicit that I could no longer pretend it away. The lie, they built the fake loans. The forged signature, the manufactured debt, was a physical manifestation of a truth I had spent 32 years denying. They did not want me to succeed, and they were willing to commit felonies to prevent it. The 3-hour drive back to Phoenix was spent wrestling with memories. Every slight, every dismissal. Every moment when I realized that no matter what I achieved, I would always be the peripheral child, the disappointment child. My brother was the center of their universe, and anything I built outside that orbit was dismissed as nerd stuff or a hobby. I remembered Thanksgiving years ago when my father had casually introduced me. Harper is still playing around with computers. The casual dismissal stung more than any shout ever could. It was that night, fueled by the cold sting of their indifference, that I made the pivotal choice. I stopped seeking their approval. I made my work invisible to them, deciding to succeed or fail entirely on my own terms. The shame of seeking their recognition was replaced by the fierce determination of self-reliance. Now that self-reliance had led me to an $89 million contract, and they had mistaken my silence for failure. As I pulled into my apartment complex in Phoenix, the fear was gone. In its place was an icy clarity. They had spent months planning my destruction, believing I was weak. They had created a lie to take my company, but in doing so, they had recorded their own crimes and handed me the evidence I needed. I was no longer fighting for their love, I was fighting for justice. Tomorrow I would face them in court. Tomorrow they would realize the daughter they dismissed had built something that mattered. And tomorrow they would begin to pay for every lie they had ever told. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door that night. The same furniture occupied the same spaces, the same photographs hung on the same walls, but I was not the same person who had left that morning, believing she was driving to a family emergency. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter and looked around at the life I had built. A modest 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, a 10-year-old car that still ran reliably, clothes from discount stores and furniture from secondhand shops. Anyone who looked at my living situation would assume I was barely getting by. That was intentional. I had spent 8 years keeping my success invisible to people who would use it against me. I had reinvested every dollar of profit back into the company. I had denied myself luxuries that most people take for granted because I understood that CentraShield needed resources more than I needed comfort. My family saw my modest lifestyle and assumed I was failing. They never bothered to ask about my work, never showed any interest in understanding what I had actually built. They were so certain of my failure that they never thought to investigate the possibility of my success, but their assumptions obscured a history paved with grueling sacrifice. When I first launched CentraShield, I worked out of a tiny storage room in the back of a defunct auto repair shop. It smelled perpetually of stale oil and gasoline, but the rent was cheap and the isolation was total. My bed was a sleeping bag thrown over a stack of server boxes. My meals were instant ramen noodles, sometimes twice a day, every day for years. There were mornings when I woke up shivering because the old AC unit had died, and nights when I worked until 3 a.m. surrounded by stacks of borrowed coding manuals powered solely by hope and caffeine. I remember pitching CentraShield to a series of venture capital firms. They weren't just skeptical, they were dismissive. One prominent investor, a man who had made his fortune on social media apps, looked at my presentation on advanced anomaly detection and laughed. Cybersecurity. That's a man's game, darling. Go start a fashion blog. Another dismissed me because I didn't have the right pedigree, meaning I hadn't graduated from an Ivy League school or served in a high-ranking military role. I would leave those polished boardrooms, retreat to my beat-up car, and cry out of pure exhaustion and frustration. But the next day, I would be back in the storage room debugging the code until my eyes burned. Every interaction with my family felt like rubbing salt in those wounds. Caleb used to call the storage room the basement of dreams and suggested I hang up a sign that read, "Going out of business soon." My mother once sent me a care package containing a pamphlet on adult career changes, subtly suggesting I rejoin my father's firm. They viewed my struggle not as tenacity, but as foolish stubbornness. The turning point came 3 years into the struggle. After yet another brutal rejection, I drove home convinced that I should finally give up and take the humiliating job offer from my father. Then an unexpected email arrived. A defense communications engineer named Dr. Chen had seen my presentation at a small, obscure industry conference. He was intrigued by my system's unique approach to anomaly detection. He wanted a demonstration for his team. I said yes before I finished reading the email. That demonstration led to a rigorous year-long pilot program. My system was subjected to the most intense testing imaginable by government experts. They were looking for flaws, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Instead, they found speed and precision. 2 weeks ago, I signed a contract worth $89 million. My company had transformed from a forgotten startup into a legitimate defense contractor with a critical national security mission. The years of ramen and freezing nights, the mockery and the near bankruptcies, it all crystallized into a single undeniable triumph. And then my father decided to destroy it all with a bankruptcy petition based on forged documents. I spent the next 3 hours on video calls with my legal team. Patricia Reeves, my corporate attorney, was furious on my behalf. "This is federal fraud," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They forged your signature on loan documents. They created false financial statements. They are trying to interfere with a government contractor. Do they have any idea what they have done? I told her they had no idea. They thought my company was worthless. They thought the bankruptcy petition would force me to shut down and come crawling back to the family business. They did not understand that attacking a defense contractor with forged documents was not a civil matter between family members. It was a federal crime. Patricia began assembling our response. We pulled every financial record CentraShield had ever produced. We gathered audit reports and tax documents and investor communications. We compiled a complete paper trail that would prove beyond any doubt that my family's claims were fabricated. Around midnight, my CFO, Ethan, sent me a message that made my blood run cold. Someone had been accessing our public filings portal from an IP address registered to my parents' house. The access occurred 3 months ago, around the time my mother had started asking unusual questions about my financial situation. They had been planning this for months. They had researched my company, gathered whatever information they could find, and used it to construct their fraudulent documents. I felt a surge of cold fury, realizing they had been conducting reconnaissance for this premeditated assault all along. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with legal documents spread across every surface building the case that would protect my company and expose their fraud. By the time the sun rose over Phoenix, I had everything I needed. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "The hearing is at 9. I will meet you at the courthouse at 8:15. I showered and dressed in my most professional suit. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I almost did not recognize. Not the timid daughter who had spent her life seeking approval from people who would never give it. Not the struggling entrepreneur who doubted herself at every turn. I saw a woman who had built something remarkable against impossible odds and who would not let anyone take it from her." The drive to the courthouse took 40 minutes. I used the time to review my notes and calm my nerves. I was not afraid of the legal battle ahead. I was afraid of seeing my family again, of facing the people who had decided to destroy me rather than celebrate my success. When I arrived at the courthouse, I found Patricia waiting on the steps. She handed me a coffee and a folder containing our response documents. "They have no idea what they are walking into," she said. "When Judge Marsh sees the name of your company, everything is going to change." I asked her what she meant. Patricia smiled grimly. Judge Eleanor Marsh spent 15 years as an economic crimes prosecutor before she took the bench. She knows every major government contractor in the region. She knows about CentraShield. And she knows that falsifying documents to attack a defense contractor is not something she will tolerate. We walked into the courthouse together. In a few minutes, I would face my family across a courtroom. In a few minutes, they would learn that the company they dismissed as worthless was worth nearly $100 million. In a few minutes, their carefully constructed fraud would begin to collapse. I was ready. The federal courthouse in Phoenix is a monument to institutional authority. Marble floors echo with footsteps. High ceilings make voices disappear into vast emptiness. Security guards examine every bag and every person who passes through the metal detectors. Everything about the building is designed to remind you that the power of the state is absolute and indifferent to individual concerns. I arrived at 8:15 as planned and found Patricia waiting near the security checkpoint. She handed me a folder and said, "We have a problem." The documents inside made my stomach drop. My family had not simply filed the original bankruptcy petition. They had added supplementary materials overnight. New loan agreements with different dates, new financial statements with different numbers, new evidence that they had clearly fabricated in the hours since our dinner confrontation. "They are digging themselves deeper," Patricia said. "Either they are incredibly stupid or they think they can outrun the truth." I looked at the metadata on the new documents, created at 10:43 p.m. by a user identified as Paul W. Guest laptop, modified at 2:14 a.m., finalized at 6:30 a.m., and filed electronically at 7:45 a.m. My father had stayed up all night manufacturing additional evidence. He was so confident in his ability to manipulate any situation that he thought throwing more forgeries at the problem would somehow make it better. Patricia walked me through our strategy. We would present our actual financial records first. We would demonstrate that every document my family had filed was fraudulent. We would request an immediate investigation into their conduct and ask the judge to dismiss their petition with prejudice. And then she said, we will let the federal implications speak for themselves. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling covered the walls. An American flag stood in one corner. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated to ensure that whoever sat there could look down on everyone else. My family was already present when I entered. They sat on the left side of the room with their attorney, a man I recognized from local society events. Arthur Blake had represented wealthy families in the Phoenix area for 30 years. He specialized in making problems disappear through aggressive legal tactics and strategic intimidation. My father wore his most expensive suit. My mother had chosen funeral colors, again black dress and pearls, as if she was mourning the daughter who had refused to submit to family control. My brothers sat between them, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of someone who believed victory was already assured. None of them acknowledged me. They did not look in my direction. They behaved as if I was not worthy of their attention, as if my presence was merely a formality before they claimed what they wanted. I took my seat on the right side of the room and waited. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff announced, "All rise for Judge Eleanor Marsh." I stood and watched as a woman in her early 60s entered through the door behind the bench. She had gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her expression suggested that she had seen every kind of deception imaginable and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. She sat down and opened the file before her. For several minutes, she read in silence. No one in the courtroom moved or spoke. Then she looked up, and her eyes locked onto the documents with sudden intensity. "Centra Shield Technologies," she said slowly, "founded by Harper Lane." Arthur Blake stood and confirmed that was correct. Judge Marsh continued reading. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "This company is a Tier 3 contractor with the Department of Defense. They are currently implementing a cybersecurity initiative across multiple federal facilities." Arthur Blake attempted to redirect. "Your Honor, the matter before the court concerns a simple debt recovery. The financial status of the company is precisely what we are here to establish." Judge Marsh removed her reading glasses and looked at him with the kind of expression that made attorneys reconsider their career choices. "Mr. Blake, are you telling me that your clients filed a bankruptcy petition against a company holding an $89 million government contract without verifying that company's actual financial status?" Silence. Complete and total silence. I watched my father's face transform. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by something I had never seen before. Fear. Caleb leaned over to whisper something to my mother. She shook her head, her complexion turning pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Patricia stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation proving that every financial claim made by the petitioners is false. The loan agreements they submitted are forgeries. The financial statements are fabrications. My client has never borrowed any money from her family, and Centra Shield Technologies is not only solvent, but extraordinarily successful." Judge Marsh asked for the documentation. Patricia handed over our files, and the judge spent the next 15 minutes reviewing them in silence while my family sat frozen in their seats. When she finished, Judge Marsh looked directly at my father. "Mr. Whitlock, are you aware that filing fraudulent documents in federal court is a felony?" My father stood, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had always worked for him in business negotiations. "Your Honor, there has clearly been some misunderstanding. We were acting on information we believe to be accurate. If there are discrepancies in the documentation, I am certain they can be explained." The judge was unmoved. "I am ordering an immediate forensic analysis of every document you have submitted. I am also referring this matter to the Federal Fraud Investigation Unit for review. You and your family are hereby prohibited from contacting the defendant or interfering in any way with Centra Shield Technologies operations." My mother began to cry, not the dignified tears of a woman wrongly accused, but the panicked sobbing of someone who had just realized the magnitude of her mistake. Caleb tried to speak, but his attorney silenced him with a sharp gesture. Judge Marsh continued, If the forensic analysis confirms what appears obvious from these documents, your family will face criminal charges, including fraud, forgery, and potential interference with a government contractor. Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" My father said nothing. For the first time in my life, I watched him stand speechless before an authority he could not intimidate or manipulate. The hearing was adjourned pending investigation. As I walked out of the courtroom, Caleb grabbed my arm. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You lied to us about your company. You made us look like fools." I pulled my arm free. "I never lied about anything. You were so certain I was failing that you did not bother to check whether I was actually succeeding." I left him standing in the hallway with his parents watching their world begin to crumble around them. The moment Judge Eleanor Marsh said the words $89 million government contract, I understood that everything had changed. Not just for me, but for my entire family. They had walked into that courtroom expecting to crush a struggling daughter with manufactured debt. Instead, they had discovered that the daughter they despised had built something worth more than anything they would ever achieve. I spent the hours after the hearing in Patricia's office reviewing our next steps. The forensic analysis would take several days. The federal investigation could take weeks or months. But the immediate crisis had been averted. My company was safe, and my family was under scrutiny. Patricia explained the legal implications with clinical precision. If forensic analysis confirmed what we already knew, my family would face federal charges: fraud, forgery, and obstruction at minimum. Potential interference with a government contractor, which carried national security implications. "Do you understand what that means?" Patricia asked. "This is not going to be resolved with apologies and a settlement. They committed federal crimes." I understood. I had understood from the moment I saw those forged documents. My family had not just attacked me personally. They had attacked a company that handled sensitive government communications. Whether they knew it or not, they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. That evening, my phone began to ring. First my mother, then Caleb, then my father. I did not answer any of their calls. Instead, I watched the voicemails accumulate, each one more desperate than the last. My mother's messages alternated between sobbing apologies and accusations. She had never meant for things to go this far. She had only wanted to help me see reason. Why was I doing this to the family? Caleb's messages were angry. I had lied to them. I had hidden my success to make them look foolish. This was all my fault, and I needed to fix it before everything fell apart. My father left only one message. His voice was cold and controlled, as if he was addressing a disappointing employee rather than his daughter. He said, "Harper, you need to come home and resolve this matter. We are still your family." I deleted all of them without responding. The next morning I received a call from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, a voice identified itself as Special Agent Marcus Hale from the Federal Fraud Investigation Unit. "Ms. Lane, we need to meet with you today. Can you come to our field office at 2 o'clock? I agreed without hesitation. Whatever the federal government needed from me, I would provide it. I had nothing to hide. The field office was located in a nondescript building in downtown Phoenix. No signs indicated its purpose. No markings suggested what happened inside. I passed through security and was escorted to a conference room where Agent Hale was waiting. He was tall and lean, with gray hair cut short and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed. He shook my hand and invited me to sit. For the next 3 hours, I answered questions about my family, my company, and the documents they had submitted. I provided access to every financial record CentraShield had ever produced. I explained the timeline of events leading up to the bankruptcy petition. Agent Hale took careful notes. Occasionally, he asked clarifying questions, but mostly he listened. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I could not read. "Ms. Lane, your family did not just file fraudulent documents. They conducted extensive reconnaissance on your company before assembling their petition. We have traced unauthorized access to your public filings from their IP address. We have identified communications between family members discussing their plan months in advance." I felt my chest tighten. I had suspected they had planned this carefully, but hearing it confirmed by a federal agent made it somehow more real. "Do you have any idea why they would target your company specifically now?" Agent Hale asked. I told him about the government contract, about how someone must have discovered that CentraShield was about to become very valuable, about how my family had always resented my independence and would want to control anything of value I produced. Agent Hale nodded slowly. We recovered emails from your mother's account discussing the contract. She mentioned needing to act before the Department of Defense paperwork was finalized. I closed my eyes. My mother had known. She had known about the contract, or at least suspected it, and had deliberately accelerated the fraud to steal my company before I could claim my success. Your mother appears to be more involved in this scheme than we initially understood, Agent Hale continued. She may have been the primary instigator. I did not know how to respond to that. All my life I had viewed my mother as a passive participant in my father's dominance. I had assumed she simply went along with whatever he decided. Learning that she had actively orchestrated my destruction felt like a knife twisting in a wound I did not know I had. Agent Hale explained the next steps. They would conduct forensic analysis of all devices used to create the fraudulent documents. They would interview each family member separately. They would build a case that would likely result in criminal charges. I want you to understand something, he said. Because this involves a defense contractor, the penalties are significantly more severe than ordinary fraud. Your family is facing serious prison time. I asked him what I was supposed to do with that information. That is up to you, he said, but I suspect you are going to need to prepare yourself for what comes next. The forensic analysis took 4 days. During that time, I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. I went to the office, I attended meetings, I reviewed code with my engineering team, but every moment felt suspended, waiting for the results that would determine my family's fate. Ethan, my CFO, noticed my distraction immediately. He had been with me since the second year of CentraShield, when I could barely afford to pay him minimum wage. He had watched me struggle and grow and eventually succeed. Now he watched me navigate the most painful chapter of my life. You do not have to pretend everything is fine, he said during a late-night work session. We all know what is happening. I appreciated his directness. Most people dance around difficult subjects afraid to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Ethan had never been that kind of person. I told him I was trying to hold everything together until we knew what the investigation would reveal. He nodded and handed me a coffee. Whatever happens, this company survives. You built something that matters, and no one can take that away from you. The call from Agent Hale came on a Friday afternoon. He asked me to come to the field office immediately. His voice carried an urgency that made my stomach drop. When I arrived, I found Patricia already waiting in the conference room. Agent Hale was accompanied by 3 other agents I did not recognize. The table was covered with documents and photographs. We completed our forensic analysis, Agent Hale said. I want to walk you through what we found. Over the next hour, he presented evidence that systematically destroyed every claim my family had made. The loan agreements were created 5 days before the bankruptcy filing. The metadata showed exactly which computer had generated each file, when modifications had been made, and by whom. My father's laptop had created the initial drafts. My mother's tablet had edited the financial statements. My brother's phone had accessed the templates from which the forgeries were constructed. Every signature on every document had been analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. None of them matched my actual signature. The variations in pressure angle and letter formation were consistent with someone attempting to forge a signature they had only seen a few times. The financial statements were fabrications assembled from publicly available information about CentraShield, combined with invented numbers designed to make the company appear insolvent. The forgers had not understood that legitimate financial documents contain watermarks and verification codes that their fabrications lacked. Perhaps most damning, Agent Hale presented emails recovered from my family's devices, communications between my mother and my father discussing the need to stop Harper before she became too successful, messages between my brother and my father outlining the steps they would take to manufacture evidence, notes from my mother to an accountant named Mark, who had apparently assisted with the financial fabrications. This was not a spontaneous act of desperation, Agent Hale said. This was a conspiracy planned over several months by multiple participants. Your family committed federal crimes with full awareness of what they were doing. I looked at the evidence spread across the table. 8 years of dismissal and contempt had culminated in a documented conspiracy to destroy my life's work. Everything I had suspected about their motivations was confirmed in black and white. Agent Hale continued, "We are prepared to file criminal charges against all 3 family members. Your father faces the most serious allegations as the apparent leader of the conspiracy. Your mother and brother are likely to receive lesser charges if they cooperate with the investigation." Patricia asked what role I would play in the prosecution. Agent Hale looked at me directly. "Ms. Lane, you are the victim here. You are not required to participate beyond providing evidence and testimony. However, I want you to understand that whatever you decide, your family will face consequences for their actions. This is not a civil matter that can be settled out of court." I asked what kind of consequences. He laid out the possibilities. Federal fraud charges carried sentences of up to 20 years. Forgery added additional time. Interference with a government contractor could involve national security statutes with even more severe penalties. My father could spend the rest of his life in prison. My mother and brother would likely face years of incarceration and lifetime criminal records. I sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what my family had done to themselves in their attempt to destroy me. Finally, I asked Agent Hale a question that had been haunting me since the investigation began. "Do they understand yet? Do they know how much trouble they are in?" He shook his head. "We have not interviewed them formally yet. They know they are under investigation, but I do not think they grasp the severity. People who are accustomed to buying their way out of problems often do not understand when they have encountered a problem that cannot be purchased." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we begin formal interviews. By this time next week, your family will understand exactly what they have done." The federal agents arrived at my parents' house at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. I know this because Agent Hale called me 20 minutes beforehand to let me know what was happening. He thought I should be prepared for the aftermath. I stood at my apartment window and watched the sun rise over Phoenix while imagining the scene unfolding in Scottsdale. 3 black SUVs pulling into my father's circular driveway, agents in dark suits approaching the front door, my mother in her bathrobe confused and terrified. My father was shouting at people who could not be intimidated by his wealth or his reputation. A profound silence settled over me. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, but a cold, heavy sense of finality. The house that had been a monument to their pride was now just a crime scene. The search warrant covered every electronic device in the house. Agents would spend hours documenting and collecting evidence, while my family watched their lives be dismantled piece by piece. I received updates throughout the day. Patricia called after the initial search to report that my father had attempted to obstruct the agents and had been warned that any further interference would result in immediate arrest. Ethan forwarded an email from one of our investors expressing concern about the investigation and requesting reassurance that CentraShield remained stable. By evening, the news had spread through the Phoenix business community. A local journalist called my office seeking comment on reports that a prominent real estate family was under federal investigation for fraud against a technology company. I declined to comment and referred all inquiries to Patricia. The interviews began the following day. Each family member was brought to the federal building separately and questioned for hours. Agent Hale briefed me on the results. My father had maintained his composure, initially insisting the entire matter was a misunderstanding. When confronted with forensic evidence, he shifted to blaming my mother and brother. When shown the emails from his own account detailing his role, he demanded to speak with his attorney and refused to answer further questions. My mother had broken down almost immediately. She cried throughout her interview, alternating between claiming ignorance and blaming my father for pressure. She admitted to signing documents she hadn't read and to accessing financial information about my company without authorization. She begged the agents to understand she had only wanted to protect the family. My brother had been the most difficult. Caleb oscillated between arrogance and panic. He insisted he was the victim of a misunderstanding, then admitted to creating forged documents, then claimed he had only done what our parents instructed. By the end of his interview, he had essentially confessed to multiple federal crimes while believing he was exonerating himself. Agent Hale summarized the situation bluntly. "Your brother's interview alone provides enough evidence for conviction. Combined with the forensic analysis and your mother's partial confession, this case is essentially complete." He paused before continuing. "However, we discovered something during the search that complicates matters. We found a bank account in Nevada registered in your name." I felt my blood run cold. I had never opened a bank account in Nevada. The initial shock of the forged loan paled in comparison to this. They hadn't just manufactured debt, they had created a ghost life for me. Agent Hale explained. The account received over $100,000 in deposits over the past 14 months. The money came from your father's real estate company. The signature on the account opening documents does not match your actual signature. The betrayal was no longer a single dramatic event. It was a pattern, a slow-motion attack on my identity that had been unfolding for more than a year. The shock of the forged loan was eclipsed by the realization that my own identity had been weaponized against me for over a year. The meticulous planning required to maintain a fraudulent identity felt more hateful than any shout or insult. This adds identity theft to the list of charges, Agent Hale said. Your mother's fingerprints were found on the original account documents. Your brother managed the online access. Your father authorized the transfers. I asked what this meant for the investigation. It means your family didn't just commit fraud against you once. They have been using your identity for over a year. This is a pattern of criminal behavior, not an isolated incident. I sat in stunned silence, processing the single devastating fact my mother's fingerprints were on the documents. My mother. All my life, I had viewed her as the passive one, the silent accomplice to my father's ambition. I had clung to the hope that deep down, she loved me unconditionally, even if she lacked the courage to defend me. Now the evidence proved she was an active participant, a co-conspirator in stripping me of my identity. A memory flashed. I was 15, showing her the heavy trophy I had won at the regional science fair. She smiled a thin, tight smile and suggested we put it away because Caleb needed the dining room table clear to study his golf course layouts. It was never about protection. It was about ensuring Caleb's light was never overshadowed by mine. It had always been a competition I didn't know I was entering in. That night I sat alone in my apartment and tried to process what I had learned. The people who raised me had stolen my identity. They had used false accounts to move money around in ways that could have exposed me to criminal liability. My heart didn't break. It hardened. Their contempt wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a deep structural flaw within them. To them, I had never been a daughter, only a resource to exploit, all while telling me they loved me, all while insisting everything they did was for the good of the family. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had never seen them clearly before, wondering how I had spent 32 years seeking approval from people who saw me as nothing more than an asset. By morning, I had made a decision. I would cooperate fully with the federal investigation. I would provide every piece of evidence requested. And I would watch as the people who had tried to destroy me face the consequences of their own choices. The indictment warning came on a Thursday. Agent Hale delivered the news personally, arriving at my office with documents that would change everything. A formal indictment warning is the final step before criminal charges are filed. It gives defendants an opportunity to cooperate, negotiate, or prepare for prosecution. For my family, it was the first official acknowledgement that their crimes would not be resolved quietly. Agent Hale walked me through the allegations one by one: conspiracy to commit federal fraud, forgery of financial documents, filing false claims in federal court, identity theft, obstruction of justice, interference with a government contractor. The charges against my father were the most severe. As the apparent leader of the conspiracy, he faced potential sentences of up to 30 years in federal prison. My mother and brother faced lesser but still substantial penalties. We are offering them an opportunity to cooperate, Agent Hale explained. If they provide full confessions and assist with the investigation, we can recommend reduced charges. If they continue to deny responsibility, we will proceed with full prosecution. I asked what I was supposed to do with this information. Nothing, he said. You are the victim here. Your role is to continue providing evidence and testimony as needed. The decisions about how to proceed belong to your family and their attorneys. But I want you to be prepared for what comes next. This investigation has attracted attention at the federal level because of the national security implications. Your family is not going to escape consequences regardless of what they decide. The family's response came within hours. My father's attorney contacted Patricia with an offer. If I would withdraw my cooperation from the investigation and sign a statement suggesting the documents might be legitimate, after all, my family would drop all claims against me and pay a substantial settlement. Patricia's response was immediate and absolute. She reminded my father's attorney that I was not the one pressing charges. The federal government was. My cooperation, or lack thereof, would not change the outcome of their prosecution. The offer was withdrawn, but the desperation behind it told me everything I needed to know about my family's state of mind. They were finally beginning to understand that money and influence would not save them from the consequences of their actions. Over the following days, I watched from a distance as their world continued to collapse. Business partners distanced themselves from my father's real estate company. Social connections evaporated as news of the investigation spread through their community. My brother's engagement was quietly called off after his fiancé's family learned about the pending charges. My mother called me 17 times in a single day. Each voicemail was more desperate than the last. She begged me to help. She promised things would be different. She insisted that she had never meant to hurt me, that everything had been my father's idea, that she was as much a victim as I was. I did not respond to any of her messages. On the 7th day after the indictment warning, I received a call from Agent Hale that I had not expected. He told me that my brother had attempted to flee the state using a plane ticket purchased by my mother. Federal marshals had stopped him at the airport. "This changes everything," Agent Hale said. "Flight is a sign of consciousness of guilt. It also means we can no longer consider your brother for reduced charges, and your mother's involvement in purchasing the ticket adds obstruction of justice to her list of offenses." I asked what would happen next. "Tomorrow morning, we will arrest your mother." I woke before dawn on the day of my mother's arrest. Sleep had been impossible, and I had spent most of the night sitting at my kitchen table, staring at photographs from my childhood. Pictures of birthday parties and holiday dinners and family vacations, all of them now contaminated by the knowledge of what my family was capable of. The arrest happened at 7:14 a.m. Agent Hale had offered to let me observe from a distance, but I had declined. I did not want to watch my mother be handcuffed. I did not want to see the fear in her eyes as agents read her rights. I did not want to carry that image with me for the rest of my life. Instead, I went to the office and tried to work. I reviewed contracts and approved expenditures and answered emails from investors who wanted reassurance that CentraShield remained stable despite the investigation. I performed the motions of my professional life while my personal life burned around me. Patricia called at noon with an update. My mother had been processed and was being held pending a bail hearing. My father had been informed of the arrest and had apparently suffered some kind of medical episode, though the details were unclear. My brother remained in custody after his attempted flight. The family that had once seemed invincible was crumbling. That afternoon, Agent Hale asked me to come to the federal building. He wanted me to observe my mother's initial interview through one-way glass. I did not want to go. I told him that watching would be too painful, that I had already suffered enough, that nothing could be gained from witnessing my mother's interrogation. He listened patiently, then said something that changed my mind. "Ms. Lane, your mother is going to attempt to explain her actions today. She is going to provide a narrative that minimizes her responsibility and maximizes her role as a victim. I think you need to hear what she says, not because it will make you feel better, but because you deserve to understand the truth about the people who raised you." I went. I sat in a small room with a window that showed my mother sitting at a metal table, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Her hair was uncombed. Her makeup was smeared from crying. Her hands trembled as she gripped a paper cup of water. The interview began with standard questions about her name, address, and relationship to the other defendants. Then Agent Hale asked her to explain how the conspiracy had begun. What followed was 2 hours of revelation. My mother had not been a passive participant manipulated by my father. She had been the primary instigator. She had first proposed the idea of filing bankruptcy against my company months ago when she learned from a society friend that CentraShield might be involved in government work. She had researched my finances, coordinated with my father on strategy, and personally created several of the forged documents. She explained her reasoning without apparent shame. If Harper succeeds, she said, Caleb will be devastated. He has always been the one with potential. He deserves to be the successful one. I could not stand by and watch his sister overshadow him. I listened to my mother describe how protecting my brother from the consequences of my success had motivated her to destroy my life. She genuinely believed that my achievement was a threat to her favored child, and she had acted to eliminate that threat without remorse. When Agent Hale asked if she understood that her actions were criminal, she looked confused. I thought we would just make her see the reason, she said. I never imagined it would go this far. I never imagined she would fight back. She never imagined I would fight back. She had been so certain of my weakness, so confident in my inability to defend myself, that she had not considered the possibility that I might have grown stronger than she realized. After the interview, Agent Hale found me in the observation room. I was crying, though I had not noticed when the tears had started. I am sorry, he said. I know that was difficult. I asked him why my mother had done this. Not the surface reason about protecting Caleb, but the deeper reason. Why did she hate me enough to destroy me? He thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Some parents cannot tolerate children who exceed them, he said. Your success represented a kind of judgment on her life choices. If you could build something remarkable on your own, then perhaps she had not built anything remarkable at all. Destroying you was easier than confronting that possibility. I stayed in that room for another hour after he left, thinking about his words and watching the empty table where my mother had confessed to her crimes. My father's arrest came 3 days after my mother's. Unlike her, he did not go quietly. The video circulated through local media within hours. My father, still one of the most prominent real estate developers in the region, was being led out of his office building in handcuffs. He shouted at the agents. He threatened lawsuits. He insisted he was being persecuted by a daughter who had never appreciated everything the family had done for her. I watched the video once, then deleted it from my phone. Seeing him in that state brought me no satisfaction. He looked diminished, smaller somehow, as if the authority he had wielded my entire life had been nothing more than a costume he could no longer wear. The formal indictment was filed the following week. Federal prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury, which returned charges against all 3 defendants. My father faced the most serious allegations: conspiracy, fraud, forgery, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. My mother and brother faced similar but lesser charges. The case received national attention. A prominent businessman accused of fabricating evidence to steal his daughter's technology company made for compelling headlines. Reporters called my office, constantly requesting interviews and comments. I declined every one of them. What I could not decline was the request from the prosecutor's office to provide testimony. They needed me to explain the timeline of events, the nature of my relationship with my family, and the impact their actions had on my life and business. I prepared for days, working with Patricia to organize my thoughts and anticipate difficult questions. On the morning of my testimony, I dressed in my most professional suit and drove to the federal building, feeling something I had not expected. I felt ready. The grand jury room was smaller than I imagined. 12 citizens sat in rows of chairs, watching me take my place at the witness table. The prosecutor, a woman named Angela Chen, guided me through my testimony with careful, steady questions that allowed me to tell my story in my own words. I spoke for nearly 3 hours. I described growing up in a family that valued my brother above all else. I explained how I had built CentraShield from nothing while being dismissed as a failure. I detailed the bankruptcy petition, the forged documents, and the discovery that my family had been stealing my identity for over a year. When I finished, the room was silent. Several jury members were visibly emotional. One woman in the front row was crying. After my testimony, I was permitted to observe the proceedings from a separate room. I watched as forensic experts presented evidence. I watched as banking records were analyzed. I watched as the full scope of my family's conspiracy was laid bare before 12 strangers who would decide whether criminal charges should proceed. The grand jury returned indictments against all 3 defendants within 2 hours of concluding testimony. It was one of the fastest decisions in the history of that courthouse. That evening, I went to see my mother at the detention facility where she was being held. I do not know why I went. Perhaps I needed closure. Perhaps I wanted to understand something that could never be understood. She looked worse than I had ever seen her. The facility's uniform hung loosely on her frame. Her eyes were red from crying. When she saw me approach the visitor's window, she began sobbing before I could say a word. For a split second, I saw the mother from my early childhood, the woman who taught me to bake cookies, who read me stories until I fell asleep, who on one rare afternoon when my father was away secretly praised my geometry grade and said I had my own kind of brilliance. That memory, so fragile, so rare, shoved itself against the image of the woman sitting before me now. The internal conflict was brutal, the instinct to reach out, and the absolute necessity to protect the woman who had built CentriShield with her own hands. "Harper," she said through the phone, "please help us. Please tell them this was all a mistake. We never meant for things to go this far." She pressed her hand against the thick pane of glass between us, a silent, desperate plea for connection. I stared at her trembling fingers, remembering the fingerprints found on the forged account documents. The glass felt like a wall of concrete, not just physically, but morally. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, who had raised me, who had apparently hated my success so much she tried to destroy it. "You meant every step I said," quietly. "You planned this for months. You forged documents. You stole my identity. You tried to take everything I built. This isn't something that happened to you. This is something you chose." She continued to cry, offering explanations and excuses that no longer meant anything. I listened for a few minutes, then stood to leave. "Mom," I said, "I hope someday you understand what you did. Not because I need your apology, but because you need to face the truth about yourself." I walked away without looking back. The mother I needed, the one who would choose me over her own fears and status, had never existed. And the woman who sat in that room had just confirmed that the illusion was finally, irrevocably over. The formal sentencing hearing took place on a cold December morning. The federal courthouse was crowded with reporters, spectators, and the few remaining supporters of my family who had not abandoned them during the investigation. I sat in the gallery with Patricia beside me, watching as my father was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his shoulders stooped. The man who had intimidated me for 32 years now shuffled to his seat like someone whose spirit had been broken. My mother and brother were brought in separately. My mother wore civilian clothes that hung loosely on her diminished frame. My brother looked haunted, his eyes constantly darting around the room as if searching for an escape that did not exist. Judge Morrison, who had overseen the case since the indictment, called the proceedings to order. The prosecution presented its recommended sentences based on the crimes committed and the defendant's cooperation or lack thereof. For my father, they recommended 10 years in federal prison. He had shown no remorse, had attempted to obstruct the investigation, and had been the primary architect of the conspiracy. The charges against him included fraud, forgery, identity theft, conspiracy, and interference with a government contractor. For my mother, they recommended 3 years. She had cooperated partially after her arrest and had pleaded guilty to reduced charges. However, her role as the initial instigator of the conspiracy warranted significant punishment. For my brother, they recommended 18 months. He had been a willing participant, but had followed the direction of his parents. His attempted flight had complicated matters, but his ultimate cooperation had earned consideration. The defense attorneys made their arguments. They spoke of family dysfunction and misunderstandings and good intentions gone wrong. They asked for leniency and mercy and second chances. Then Judge Morrison invited victim impact statements. Patricia squeezed my hand as I stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. I had prepared remarks but decided at that moment to speak from my heart instead. I told the court about growing up feeling invisible in my own family. I described the years of building my company while being dismissed as a failure. I explained how discovering the conspiracy had shattered my understanding of the people who raised me. But mostly, I talked about what I had learned. I learned that some people cannot celebrate your success because it threatens their sense of superiority. I learned that family is not defined by blood, but by how people treat you. I learned that the hardest part of surviving betrayal is not the betrayal itself, but accepting that the people you loved were never who you thought they were. I looked at my family as I spoke. My father stared at the table in front of him, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother cried silently. My brother watched me with an expression I could not read. "I do not want revenge," I said finally. "I want accountability. I want them to understand that actions have consequences. I want them to face the truth about what they did not, because it will make me feel better, but because it might help them become better people." I returned to my seat as Judge Morrison prepared to deliver the sentences. For Paul Whitlock, 6 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. For Linda Whitlock, 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. For Caleb Whitlock, 14 months in federal prison, followed by 18 months of supervised probation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the sentences were announced. My father collapsed forward in his chair. My mother wailed. My brother simply sat frozen, unable to process what had happened. Patricia put her arm around me as we walked out of the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions that I ignored. Cameras flashed in my face that I did not see. All I could think about was how different this moment felt from what I had expected. I had thought I would feel triumphant. I had thought watching my family face justice would bring me satisfaction or closure or peace. Instead, I felt empty, hollow, like something inside me had been removed and nothing had taken its place. 6 months have passed since the sentencing. My father is serving his time at a federal facility in Colorado. My mother is in a minimum security prison in Arizona, closer to home but still behind walls she never imagined she would see from the inside. My brother completed his sentence early due to good behavior and is now living in New Mexico, trying to rebuild a life that will never be what he expected. CentraShield continues to thrive. The Department of Defense contract was successfully implemented, and our systems now protect communications at facilities across the country. We have hired additional engineers, expanded our offices, and begun developing new technologies that could transform the industry. I moved into a new apartment last month. Not extravagant, but nicer than anywhere I had lived before. I chose a place with large windows that let in morning light, and I filled it with furniture that I selected myself rather than inherited or received as gifts. The first thing I hung on the wall was a photograph of my engineering team taken the day we completed our Pentagon installation. 17 people who believed in the company when almost no one else did. 17 people who worked beside me through the hardest years of my life. 17 people who became the family I chose. I have thought often about what it means to choose your family. For most of my life, I believed that family was something you were born into, an obligation you inherited along with your name and your features and your predispositions. I was wrong. Family is not about genetics or obligation or the accidents of birth. Family is about the people who support you when everything falls apart. Family is about the people who celebrate your successes without jealousy and comfort your failures without judgment. My biological family failed that test in the most spectacular way imaginable. They looked at my success and saw a threat. They looked at my independence and saw a betrayal. They looked at everything I had built and decided it would be better destroyed than allowed to flourish. I do not hate them for what they did. Hatred requires energy that I prefer to invest elsewhere. I do not forgive them either, at least not in the sense of pretending their actions did not matter. What I feel instead is something closer to acceptance. I accept that they are who they are. I accept that their choices had nothing to do with my worth as a person and everything to do with their own limitations and fears. I have not visited my mother in prison. She writes me letters every week filled with apologies and explanations and requests for reconciliation. I read them once, then file them away without responding. Perhaps someday I will have something to say to her. Today is not that day. My brother sent a single email after his release asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. I did not respond. He has not tried again. My father has made no attempt at contact. According to his attorney, he maintains that the entire prosecution was a miscarriage of justice and that I orchestrated his downfall out of spite. Even from prison, he cannot accept responsibility for his own choices. I think about the person I was before all of this happened. A woman who still hoped her family would see her clearly. A woman who measured her worth by whether she had earned their approval. That woman does not exist anymore. In her place is someone stronger. Someone who knows that external validation is worthless if it comes from people who cannot be trusted. Someone who has learned that the hardest battles are not fought against external enemies, but against the parts of ourselves that believe we deserve to be treated poorly. I built CentraShield from nothing. I turned a dream into a company that protects the communications of military personnel around the world. I survived a conspiracy designed to destroy me and emerged not just intact, but more powerful than before. None of that happened because my family supported me. All of it happened despite their contempt. Last week, I received an email from a young woman who had read about my story in a business magazine. She wrote that she was starting her own company and that her family had told her she would fail. She asked if I had any advice. I wrote back a single paragraph. Build something that matters to you, not to them. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your growth instead of feeling threatened by it. And remember that their doubts say nothing about your capabilities and everything about their fears. Success is the best response to people who never believed in you, not because it proves them wrong, but because it proves you right. I saved that email in a folder labeled Messages That Matter. Someday, when this chapter of my life feels more distant, I want to remember that something good came from all this pain. The night after the sentencing, I walked to a bridge near my apartment and watched the sunset over the Phoenix skyline. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the kind of beauty that makes you forget for a moment that the world contains ugliness. I thought about the dinner where my father pointed his finger at my face and told me to shut down my worthless business. I thought about the courtroom where Judge Marsh discovered the truth about my company. I thought about the federal investigation that revealed the depth of my family's betrayal. Then I thought about the future, about the technologies I still want to build, about the people I still want to help, about the life I still want to live. I chose myself. After 32 years of choosing them, of bending myself into shapes that might earn their love, I finally chose myself. It was the best decision I have ever made. If you've ever had to build your success while the people closest to you hoped you would fail, then you know this pain. The path to freedom is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. Find your chosen family, commit to your worth, and never let anyone else write the final chapter of your story. I promise you have the strength to do it even if you can't.